Wantchekon, who is of Princeton in the African School of Economics, who's going to present to us a piece called Critical Junctures, Independence Movements and Democracy in Africa.
Okay. So this is a very macro political economy paper, so which try to address a very big question, which is where does democracy come from? So there are two possible explanations that have been provided. One is modernization theory. I'm going to be specific about it in a second. And the other one, which is not as developed, but I think equally important, is the critical juncture framework. So modernization theory, trying to find connection between level of democracy and development by focusing on trade, places where you can move assets more quickly. You can put more pressure on government to democratize. It could be education, like I mentioned earlier, places that have a level of education, they tend to be more democratic. And now, the literature recently have found that this explanation is weak. That in fact, the association between democracy and growth, democracy and development is extremely weak. And now, there is another framework which is far less developed that this paper tried to highlight and develop a bit further, is the idea that every society has a critical juncture. There are times where some type of countries go left, some type of country go right. So those junctures, you need to identify them, and you need to explain what happened there. That explain why some of the countries, for instance, will embark in a different path as others. So, so one of those junctures, at least in context of Africa, is the independent movement and the independence time around the 60s, 58 and 60s. So, the argument in a nutshell is that I find that democracy in Africa is better explained by the way the country became independent. So countries that became independent through peaceful protest, urban social movement, they tend to, like Ghana, Benin, Senegal, South Africa to some degree, are more likely to be democratic. And the countries that became independent through violence, especially rural insurgency, like Cameroon, like Zimbabwe, Chad, Somalia, they tend to be more autocratic. So there is, if you think of democracy in Africa, don't think about development level, because there are many African countries are similar. When you want to think of democracy in Africa, think of the way the country became independent. The one that became violently independent tend to have bad institutions today and tend to be autocratic. The one that became independent through peaceful protests, they tend to be more democratic today. So, and we find evidence for causality by exploiting different empirical approaches. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So, okay, so why it's good when you want to study democracy to look at Africa? Because if you take Asian countries, for instance, by and large, they are all autocratic, like China, Vietnam, and so on. When you look at the Americas, they tend to be more democratic. But Africa is mixed. So you have mixed regime, democratic, a little bit autocratic. You have, strong, consolidated democracy like South Africa, like Benin and Ghana, Mali, Senegal. And then you have a lot of harshly autocratic regime, like Ethiopia today, or Eritrea, and so on. So Africa is mixed in terms of regime type, which makes it a good place to study what makes a country democratic, Now, so, now another important element is that, okay, let me move very quick. So, okay, so why independent movement? Why do I focus on independent movement as a critical juncture? Because if you want to look at political societies today in Africa, they were founded in 1945. It's 1945 that unions, political parties, new leaders, you know, came about in most African countries. And those leaders, you can divide them in two types. There were many who were European-style socialists, like Kwame Nkrumah, like Julius Nyerere in Kenya. They're also Maoist radical, like Frantz Fanon in Algeria, Kimati in Kenya, Ruben Umiobe in Cameroon. So you can see that at the birth of political society in Africa, there were two types of leaders. Leaders who were sort of picking social movement, urban protests, unions as a way to mobilize for independence, and those who decided to use violence, especially rural rebellion, as a way to become independent. And you can see that from these quotes by Julius Nyerere. So in 1958, he stressed the importance of nonviolent opposition to the colonial rule by saying, we shall wage a relentlessly determined battle against colonialism until we are free. We shall use no violence. We shall stoop to no dishonest method. We shall be as clean in our methods as we are in our aims. We shall publicly declare our aims as we publicly we have declared our method as we declare our aims. So it's not just what you want to do, it's how you do it. So we want to become independent, but we have to do it peacefully. We have to do it through street demonstration. So now look at this, a sharp contrast. Frantz Fanon said, violence is the way to go. He said, at national level, insurgent violence unifies the people. At the individual level, it's a cleansing force. It frees the native from the inferiority complex, from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restore his self-respect. So he was romanticizing the use of violence as a way to become independent. And Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote the preface, who wrote a words of support for the book, you probably studied it in high school, Les Damnés de la Terre. Today, I wonder why we will teach these things to kids. Terminal. This is Damnés de la Terre. And, like Jean-Paul Sartre says that we should kill the white settlers. Because when you kill the white settler, you are killing the colonizer, you're also killing the colonized. Because as soon as you kill a white settler, you are free. Your inferiority complex that you have developed after years and years is gone. So, and when you have been repressed, colonized, exploited for such a long time, some people might believe this. Some people might actually feel like this is the way to go. It's not clear that you should go with Nkrumah and Nyerere, or you should go with Frantz Fanon. So now, what I'm going to argue is that the decision to go one way or the other depends, in fact, on geography. So, and this is Amilcar Cabral, who is the leader of the PAIGC, the independent movement in Guinea-Bissau. He says, everyone knows that in general, the guerrilla force uses the mountains as a starting point for armed struggle. We have to take full advantage of the jungle and swamps in our country to create difficult conditions for the enemy in his confrontation with victorious advance of our armed forces. So, and he did very well, because if you take PAIGC is in Guinea-Bissau and in Cape Verde, right? In Guinea-Bissau, they use violence to try to become independent. And in Cape Verde, they use peaceful. So, and he himself, he's Fidel Castro's friend, and admirer. So his intrinsic motivation is to go with violence, but yet it's impossible to do it in Cape Verde because it's a small island, flat, nowhere to hide. So the idea, and this is an important idea that we are going to use for re-identification. So, okay, now the first part of the exercise is, let me maybe talk briefly about the theory. The theory is one in which, given the geographic condition of the country, you can use one or the other. And I'm arguing that when you do mass protest, you develop norms of peaceful political expression and compromise. When we raise kids from the beginning, we tell them, don't hit, don't. And this, because we expect that when you teach kids at early age not to overreact, they internalize the norm, and they seek compromise, they seek persuasion, as opposed to violence. But then, in contrast, armed rebellion will generate a culture of political exclusion, and perpetuate the use of violence. So when you are born violently, you're likely to perpetuate violence and fear in the future, So I'm going to go through the detail in a second. So now, here are pictures of the Mau Mau insurgency in Kenya, and here is a picture of urban insurgency, in South Africa. So you can see people here, they are using guns, and over there they are using their words. They are expressing themselves peacefully. Okay. So, and that's very important. Now, to see, the idea we are developing here is the idea of persistence. So, if things used to happen some way then, it's more likely to happen the same way now. There is, it's the idea of persistence, that the idea of culture as persistence that we are exploring. So take, for instance, this is urban uprising in Egypt in 1919. Take, same thing in 2011. You can see that the difference between the two pictures, one is black and white, the other one is colored. More people here, less people over there. But the strategy is very, very similar. If you take Libya, for instance, the first form of resistance in Libya was armed struggle, and the civil war was also violent as well. In between, you have Gaddafi, So the idea that we are developing in this paper is to say that history explains democratic outcome institutions better than education, wealth, and many other things, So let me tell you about the data. We collected the data ourselves. I sent my co-author, who is my student, sent him to France and London, to Paris and London, to look through the archives and code all the independent movement across Africa. And then we code an independent movement as a rural insurgency on the basis of the following criteria. There should be one anti-colonial revolt between 1900 and the year of independence. And the rebel group should originate from the rural areas. And the goal should be independent regime change, and they have to use guerrilla tactics, And then there should be at least 1,000 deaths, That's the definition of insurgency. Okay, here is a picture of Africa in terms of rural insurgency, urban insurgency. The dark are rural, the lights are urban. As you can see, most West African countries were urban. Most of East Africa is rural insurgency, I mean. So, but again, you have enough variation so that you can do some econometrics. Okay, so here is the paper. So the paper could basically end here. So you can see, we look at the trajectory of democracy in Africa since 1960 until 2010. And you can see, like this picture is the urban protest countries, and here it's the rural insurgency countries. So I divided Africa in two sets of countries, the urban protest countries and the rural insurgency countries. And you can see from 1960 to 1990, the urban protest countries were slightly above the rural insurgency countries in terms of level of democracy. But then, and then after 1990, the difference between the two became really clear and transparent. This is true if you use polity measure, or true if you also use Freedom House measure, So interestingly, this also matters for growth, for economic development. if you look at, the dotted line are the countries with rural insurgency past, and this one are the one with urban protest past, And you can see that from 1950 to 1980, basically it was, it was more or less the same between the two types of country, but, in the 70s, the urban protest country were below, you can see. But then after, the Cold War, like in 1990, and until today, you can see that those countries are performing more poorly than the urban protest countries. So this is perhaps an argument that, in fact, even if growth doesn't create democracy, democracy helps growth. So that's this is what this shows. Okay, now so here we try some basic exercise in looking at the relationship between type of independent movement, rural insurgency, with democracy, and you can see they are negative throughout. So now, we try to deal with endogeneity by using terrain, though, as I mentioned earlier, like using the intuition from Cabral, that terrain will decide you decide whether you want to fight violently or peacefully. And so here is the basic correlation first, controlling for a number of covariates, rural versus a number of covariates. And you can see it's negative, rural insurgency is negative. And so you use Freedom House, the same thing, and you can look at the several types of specification, using all control, geographic control, colonial control, contemporary control, blah, 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 result the same. So now you can say, well, we made mistake in coding the countries. We made a lot of mistake in coding the countries. Some countries are not really like urban protests, and because sometimes you have both. So to show that the results are robust, we exclude one country at a time and see whether the coefficients remain. We also exclude, West Africa altogether, East Africa altogether, Central Africa altogether, and the results still remain. So it shows that it's not coding. In fact, there is some basic story that are really important behind this. Now, I talk about IV. So basically, we use IV approach. First stage, we explain rural insurgency by the terrain, okay? And then the second stage is democracy, rural, using the residuals as an IV strategy. And you can see that there is a positive relationship here between rough terrain and insurgency. So more likely, bigger countries with a lot of jungle and mountains, they are more likely to use violent strategy to become independent. And then when we control for pre-colonial institutions, the results still remain, because you can say that, well, it's not geography today. It's maybe the kind of institution that was in the country before the country became independent. That's why we control for pre-colonial institutions. As you can see here, the results remain. And then, the second stage, you see the relationship. So the relationship is causal, okay? Now, so you can talk about maybe potential violation or exclusion restriction, that there might be terrain might explain democracy through income, or it could explain democracy through post-independence violence. We are going for this, not for this. So we need to rule out this, and that's what we did. So we use some falsification exercise and other things that might might explain the channel that might exclude the channel that we are talking about, and the result remains. So another thing that people told us is that, well, and this is really important, this is really interesting. So there is a literature talking about the fact that countries that have bad geography tend to have civil war. You see what I mean? Like countries that have rough terrain tend to have civil war. We show here that they have civil war only if they had rural insurgency in the past. You see what I mean? Like the difference between Tanzania and Kenya. Tanzania, you can say Tanzania had bad geography, but we are lucky to have Nyerere. So the culture of peaceful protest, of peaceful political expression, help overcome the tendency to use violence in Tanzania. You can talk about South Africa versus Zimbabwe. You know, South Africa had a really rough terrain, but we were lucky to have Mandela. That's helped set the seed for, so geography is not destiny. Geography has an effect through culture. And to identify culture, you have to understand how the country was born, if you will. Born meaning here how we became independent. And then the decision to become independent, the decision about how you became independent was dictated by geography. But when the right decision was made, it can help overcome the effect of geography in the future. You know? So anyway, so that's what this shows. So for instance, you look at the relationship here between, let's say, civil war explained by mountains. Okay, here is it. Civil war explained by mountains. When you don't include rural insurgency, it's positive. But then as soon as you include rural insurgency, it goes away here and here. So it shows that geography can be overcome. You know, geography can be overcome. And also, I mean, the general story here is that okay, let me put it this way. So every important decision we make, especially decision made at critical juncture in the history of a country, will dictate what happened in the future. Will dictate what happened in the future. So anyway, so maybe like in 1950, when UPC was decided to go countryside to fight Korea rule violently. When who else? When in Algeria, for instance, the FLN decided to fight the French violently, they were thinking about a practical way to defeat the French. But then this set the country on a path of destruction in the future because the institutions were weakened, because it developed a culture of violent political participation. You know, I mean, to give you an illustration, for instance, of this, you know, in Libya, for instance, when the Benghazi people were asked why they didn't start civil war right away, they said we didn't have any gun, you know. So while in Tunisia, which is an urban protest country, this was not even on the table. We don't do that here, you know. And since there are a lot of Ghanaians in the room, let me tell you a story that a friend of mine, Kwame Appiah, told me when I presented this paper to him. And he said that his dad, who used to be a politician, you know, who was a politician who died, at the height of the crisis, where Rawlings were killing people. I mean, anyway, there's a lot of uncertainty. Anyway, I'm not going to open a wound here. And he said that the meeting was so dark, people were so concerned about the violent tone that politics were taking in Ghana. And then they said, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do in the face of this crisis? The response was, let's set up a newspaper. Let's write a newspaper. Let's create a newspaper. You know, while in other places, like maybe in Kenya, maybe in Nairobi, it doesn't have to take that long for people to just say, well, let's go and kill a couple of people and so on. So it's important to understand that, anyway, violence has an effect and can have persistent effect on institutions. Okay, so, this exercise is very interesting for the graduate student here, for the MA student here. If IV is not working, you can do, if people are not convinced about your IV, you can do some sensitivity analysis to show how bad the exclusion restriction has to be, how far away can you be from the exclusion restriction assumption for your result to go away. So with that, the exercise we did here. Okay, let me talk about, we also use the difference in different approach with fixed effect. So I'm not going, okay, now let me talk about the mechanism. Okay, let me talk about the mechanism. There are two stories you can tell here. One is that, okay, when you become independent through violence, the institutions after independence will be exclusive because only winners will have the right to govern. You see what I mean? It's a zero sum. You win or you lose. You lose, you are out. You win, you are in, period. Like, what's his name? Mugabe used to say, when he's challenged, he will say, where were you when we were in the bush? We have the legitimacy to rule forever because we were there when it was tough, So, in contrast, those places where independence happened peacefully, they will tend to be more inclusive because it's not a zero sum, You see what I mean? It's a more horizontal. It's a mass movement, So you can see that the institutions following violent protests will tend to set the stage for autocratic rule. Kagame will say all the time, I'm born leader because, you see what I mean? So, okay, so it could be institutions. Now, it could also be norms, as I mentioned earlier, meaning that if my grandfathers used violence, I'm more likely to use violence today. Because I internalize the idea that the way to fight for change is through violence. You have to impose your will on the enemy, period. While if your grandfathers, political grandfathers, were peaceful protesters, this is what you do, So, and you can explain how this happens. It could be that some of us were alive when the old leaders, some of us were alive when the old leaders were still alive also. They teach us the way to do these things, and we perpetuate, things, Even in this country, something similar happened. I remember that when I became political activist, there were some Maoists who were coming from France and telling us that, the way we should fight for democracy in Benin is to fight from the countryside, from the northern part of the country, and so on. And some people came and say, where are the mountains? Where do you fight for where people are going to find you immediately and get rid of you, So what I'm saying is that, those norms persist, and I'm really insisting enough on this. Okay, and since I don't have a lot of time left, and Nyerere knew that. He was saying in 1967 that the way they choose to become independent will constrain choices, maybe 3 minutes, will constrain choices that future generation will make. That's what he was saying here. So we look at two, we look at the institutional mechanism and the culture mechanism and the norms mechanism. And you can see when you have a rural insurgency, you are more likely to have coup after independence. You are more likely to have armed rebellion after independence. And you are less likely to have peaceful demonstration after independence. You are less likely to have workers' strike after independence. So, but then we find no empirical evidence for the institutional channel. All the evidence we find for the cultural channel. So, anyway, so we use Afrobarometer as well and find that countries that have a rural insurgency, there is more support for violence in Afrobarometer data. There are more support for one-party rule, So not only the country level data supports the argument, but even like the micro data from Afrobarometer supported the same argument. So to finish, I think the Benin is a very interesting place because overall the country is urban protest country. But then there is one place that has violent rebellion, is Atakora, this area, where there was a rebellion by Kaba. What we find is that these people here tend to support violence more than the rest of Benin. So, and we support violence more than people believe. And then the further away, and then you see, between them and the rest, these people support violence less, but far more than the rest.
Is that a mountain?
Yes, it's a mountain. Yeah, Atakora is here. So, it was a really sophisticated guerrilla warfare by Kaba that took place for a long, long time. So you look at within country, you still find this effect. And I hear stories by some friend from that area today that to show the power of culture, like I heard that, in some communities in this area, if you come and you are wearing like khaki, like gendarme, they run immediately. They see you, they just run immediately. And you wonder how kids who have nothing, who have no idea, were not there in 1918 or 1917 when the rebellion was taking place, was reacting the same way their grandfathers were after they were defeated. You see what I mean? So it shows that there are norms that were transmitted from generation to generation in this area that makes them more likely to accept violence as a way of doing this. So concluding remark, so what this paper shows is that, if you hear that Africa is too uneducated to be democratic, it's a lie. When you hear that Africa is not developed enough to be democratic, it's a lie. Development outcome, education in particular, is not really correlated with democracy. What explains democracy, among other things, is norms of political participation, political expression, at least in Africa, that were born after 1945, when political societies in Africa were set up. That's where we have parties, we have unions, and so on. And the country that got into a path of violent protest followed the path of less democracy, less development, and the country that followed the urban protest path followed the path, made the choice of less democracy, sort of urban protests, they follow the path of more democracy, more development. So when you talk about political risk in Africa today, one important element that you have to consider is how the country became independent. For instance, when people talk to me about Ghana Ghana is not a risk country, period. Forget it. Bring me anything. It's not a risk country because there is a culture that was set up then that explains. Benin, no, it's not a risk country. No. Things might happen, but we are going to figure it out. But other countries, sorry to say, like Cameroon, like Zimbabwe, like Ethiopia, like Somalia, they are. Now, before I finish completely, I'm sorry, but this is not destiny. this is not destiny. I'm not saying that there is nothing you can do. Because Mozambique today is a rural insurgency country and is the most democratic. So what do is be aware of this risk and do something about it. So if you take countries like Sierra Leone, like Liberia, one thing that you can do, for instance, to set up youth movement, women's movement, to get people to habituate themselves to actingly, moderately, when they have even radical demand. You see what I mean? Like, you went to, so develop a new culture of engagement, social movement, and then this impulse of using violence, which is born merely, more or less from how the country was created, this can be controlled. You see what I mean? So anyway, so this is basically the story of the paper, and I hope you like it. Thank you. Yeah?
All right, questions?
I'm sorry? Okay, let's... D'accord.
Really the framework and the concept. And most importantly, I understand the hypothesis that is to explain the type of democracy.
Yes.
And even in terms of terrain and different things. Even the conclusion that those countries who had a kind of rural insurgency have less growth.
Yes.
But something I would have really want to see as a key factor is maybe the colonial influence, power, in terms of resistance.
Yes.
Or in another way, is there any correlation or relationship between
The choice of the type and the level of repression that the colonial power puts on the insurgents themselves?
indeed?
Yes.
And also, because I'm thinking about maybe mountain type, but that's another question. Yeah, that is the first is about the colonial powers. And I'm taking an example of Guinea, Conakry, and Cote d'Ivoire.
Yes.
And those countries where you can realize, okay, this is what the colonialists say. We are peaceful, don't have mountain, then we will help you develop. But you're violent, we will destroy you, and we will prove to others that you cannot develop.
Exactly.
So that there is also a kind of link.
Exactly.
It's not only about internal factor.
Yes.
The external factor.
Yes.
Is still in
I think it's like an argument like Martin Luther King's or Gandhi's argument, and say, well, I mean, if you have to choose your terrain, right? I mean, if you want to fight violently with a far superior power, it's self-destructive, you know? So, meaning that the urban protest approach works not only because it teaches people to use their words, to work together, to use the strength of numbers to impose their will on the opponent, as opposed to individual heroic acts to try to destroy the enemy. That's one part of it. The second part is that you are in fact triggering a far more violent reaction from the power, and this creates some kind of cycle, some kind of internal cycle of violence, repression, violence, repression, violence, repression. That even leads a long-lasting effect, you know, on the citizens.
And the second part of my question was, now, talking about, why can't you say urban insurgency and rural protest? Were no protests in rural area, people peacefully demonstrating or claiming their right in rural areas?
Yeah, I understand. But unfortunately, it's almost impossible. I mean, it's very rare to have rural protests, right? Because people are scattered. You know, protest happens when you have a large number of people, a very large number of people, and you have coordination problem. So geography and proximity plays a role in making urban protests possible. You know, so that's why insurgency will tend to happen in rural areas. But sometimes you have violence in cities. But then it's almost impossible, because urban guerrilla takes a lot of weaponry, sophistication that in 1950, 1960, many of leaders did not have. You see what I mean? And even those who tried fail. And what happens is that you try to oppose a little bit violence in the cities, they go after you, you run to the countryside, hide in the mountains, start resisting. So what I'm saying is that it's not, you cannot have an equilibrium, a stable equilibrium with like violent urban and protest rural. It's the geographic conditions, the technological conditions makes it almost makes it very difficult. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry, yeah. No, a little bit more south.
I'm not from there.
Okay, good.
So I'm not here to say.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm not.
Yeah, that's okay.
Most of the things you say is true, but I wonder whether the true reason why people are more keen to violence
Yeah.
is not education.
Yeah.
Because in Benin, that region happened to be. I think it's the region where education is the lowest.
Yeah.
Until recently, we only have one secondary school where you
Yeah.
go to, the last class.
Yeah.
Until recently, which means wherever you are in Antakora, if you go to Sudan, you have to go to that school.
Yeah.
I think it was like that until 10 years ago. Only one or two decent hospitals for the whole region.
I see.
Until today, if you want to travel in Antakora, you have to put 30 minutes, 1 hour per. You do approximately 30 kilometers per hour. If you're not on the main street, that's
I see.
Yeah. So very few infrastructure.
Yeah.
Very few access to the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So then they rarely see.
So development outcome education.
They rarely see a policeman.
Yes.
And policemen, the first contact they had with policemen or gendarmes is to take that story that the tax.
Yes.
The tax that they use.
Yeah.
And it's done with, it's not peaceful.
Yeah, I know.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
You have a story like that in your book.
Exactly.
So it's exactly what happened. So until today, some people who live there, when they see a policeman, they still believe
That
man.
exactly.
So I think it's ignorance.
Yeah. Clearly, no, I agree.
So I wonder what's the interaction between mountains, lack of infrastructure, education.
Yeah. No, I agree. So if you want to do this, you need to sort of, I use this to illustrate a little bit the point I wanted to make. But then, okay, there is something else that's very interesting. So because of this violent kind of past, the first school that was set up in the region, the teachers, okay, in Zainando where I was born, the first school, the teachers were priests, okay? In Natitengu, the teachers were soldiers. The teachers were soldiers. And then, tell me the best known the best known intellectuals or the best known success stories from Atakora, they are military men, like Kwandete and Kereku. So even those who were educated, they were more likely to join the army. And, even like the school was set up in 1922. So, but clearly the reinforcing factor, something that will reinforce this sense of isolation that lead to violence and blah, 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 this could be part of the explanation. This could be part of the explanation. But for the cross-country story that we tell, we control for all this kind of stuff. But then for Benin in particular, maybe it's something to look at more closely. Maybe you can think of lack of education infrastructure as a reinforcing effect of this tendency to use violence in this area.
So we have a Sier here. And
Yes.
Just if it's possible to keep the comments smaller.
And the response shorter as well, right? Okay.
Just one comment. I was wondering how is it possible? I agree that history is persistent.
Yeah.
I was wondering how much of this is the critical juncture
Yeah.
versus just cultural or social attitudes that predate the independence struggle, what was reflected
So one of the major independence leaders went to school in the U.S., moved to Ghana to start a printing press, and then he was kicked out of the Benin. And then he moved to Lagos to set up his own printing press, and used that to write about independence. And so you see that the movement was predated by a culture of openness and
Yeah, you mean from 1900 to 1945?
even prior to
that. Yeah. So we try to control for that. We try to control for that by using pre-colonial institutions. So basically, the exercise explaining type of protest, type of movement. We use mountains or geography, but we could also add other things. We could do other things. But clearly, I think it's hard to argue that 1945 to 1960 was really a critical juncture in the history of Africa. So before there were colonial under colonial rule. After that there were independence, and between those 10 years, things happened, and things happened differently. You might find cases like what you mentioned, where there were things that precede what happened in 45 that reinforce, the story we are talking about. The story might be far more complex than I'm telling here in some specific cases, but an exercise like this is an exercise of average. So here is an average story. You might have some country that falls off this explanation. Some will fall in, but they are more likely to fall in than fall out. Yeah. Yes.
Use of violence today, because of the political history of historical political history of the country, is not a fatality.
It's not a
Fatality.
Yes.
I think it's the same thing for the
urban protest.
exactly. So for me, don't you think that there is a threshold for people that they can act or they can protest peacefully, but there is a threshold and at that moment they will be probably start using violence, like in country like Benin.
Yeah.
Because when you say they will not use violence, they will not use violence,
Yeah.
maybe
I agree.
will not always be like that.
I agree. But okay, let me put it this way. But, maybe I'm biased here towards peaceful protests, But the story is that I believe that the peaceful protest equilibrium is more stable. Because what I see sometimes is people getting off and coming back. Getting off and coming back, If you take Guinea, for instance. What happened in Guinea under Sékou Touré is insane. It's crazy how anybody could survive this. And if, based on this pass, the first democratic election in Guinea will be violence forever. But then the Fulani candidate, I forgot his name, who actually many people think won the election, he ended up conceding and say, this is bigger. And people like what happened in Ghana, what happened in Ghana, if it were happening in Kenya, it's done, because clearly the candidate who currently won, came close to winning several times. Many people believe that he won, but then the initial reaction is to say, well. And this is what, look at the last election we shouldn't trivialize this thing. We should take it seriously. What happened between Talon and Zinsou is incredible. The way these people hate each other, and yet, in the end, they all went down. Currently, I know people who work with Zinsou and people who work with Talon who are involved in projects together. This is incredible. So the power of this dominates. So you see what I mean? Dominate the other one. So I think that countries that were violent in the past can come back and stay. Countries that were peaceful can get off. but more likely to come back again, you know, because people will understand and see that peaceful is more. Anyway, so now I'm preaching here, but but
All right.
okay.
So, before we end and congratulate the speaker, I just want to say the presentation that I will do tomorrow speaks to exactly why Nyerere and leaders like that made those choices.
Exactly. So you were all invited. So I mean, you stay where you are. You can leave tonight. Yeah, you come to stay at the same place. Don't. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And then yeah. Yeah, and then Saturday. What's happening on Saturday? I'm sorry?
Policy forum first.
Policy forum and then keynote speech. So each of you bring 5 people because the room needs to be full. Okay? All right, thank you very much.